Hello. In this video, you're going to see three different types of paint. You can see examples of the three different types of paint over here on the right-hand side, and I'm going to take you through it step by step and show you the three, and you're going to choose one of the three for your project. So I'm going to start off with the most difficult one, in my opinion, the trickiest one, which is watercolor paint. Watercolor paint is not the patties like the cakes that you buy from Crayola. They actually are liquid and they come in little tubes. You don't need a lot of the paint to work with. You will need a plastic tray. And in these three divots, I put obviously yellow, green, and blue. The amount of paint that I put in there is about the size of my pinky nail. And then I filled the reservoirs up with water. And as you can see, I used some of this. So the water is almost gone in this one. So I'm just going to add it by squeezing the tip of the brush and releasing the water into the reservoir. So you'll need a bamboo brush to paint with, and what you're going to do is let the water kind of dissolve the paint. You can use your brush to swirl around the paint, but you cannot touch the paint with the tip of your brush. Then you can go right ahead on in and start painting, and I will zoom in on this sneaker here so you can see it in action. So I have yellow on this brush, and also I'll use yellow. It might be a little bit too light for you to see, but it's there. So the problem with watercolor paint is it has a mind of its own sometimes if you, by accident, touch different colors together when they're wet. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to rinse my brush in the water, and now I'm going to pick up some blue. And if you remember your color theory, yellow and blue make green. And I'm going to place the blue right next to this wet yellow, and you'll see the blue get pulled into the yellow and start to bleed out here and here. So if you're using watercolor paint, what you have to do so you don't get this unfortunate accident from happening is you'll have to wait. Paint one area first and then wait till the next day so you know that it's dry before you paint a second section next to it so that you don't get that bleeding effect. You can always layer your colors, make them thicker, make them more bright, make them stand out more. Once the layer is dry, you can go back over the top of it. Because you're not using watercolor paper, you can't keep going back and forth with your brush because you're going to rip a hole right through your paper with the water and the brush itself. So once you have the area laid down with watercolor, you let it go and you don't go back over once it gets wet. You can go back over once it's dry. So the other option that you have, another option, is a watercolor pencil. They look like this. Not to be confused with colored pencils. This pencil is made up of watercolor paint in a very dry form. So to use these, you'll need the bamboo brush again, and the watercolor pencil just gets applied like a colored pencil, except you don't color the whole entire area in. You do small areas at a time. And then you add your water once that area is colored with your bamboo brush. And you'll see that it actually turns the pencil marks into paint. Fun! I love watercolor pencils. They're really fun to work with. The problem that sometimes happens with watercolor pencils is that students think that they can color in the entire area first and then go over the whole thing with water. Same thing will happen that happened down here with the bleeding of the two colors together. You cannot work next to a wet area with a different color. The colors will get pulled in together. The other thing too is when you're coloring with these pencils, you're depositing the watercolor paint pigment onto the paper. So the darker the color, the coloring, the more pressure you put, the more paint gets applied. If you colored an entire area in as with a very firm pressure, that's a lot of paint. When you start adding water to that, you're going to be building up the pigment on your brush, and it's going to get darker and darker and darker as you go through the area, and you don't want that. You want to try to stay a consistent color. But watercolor pencils are pretty fun to work with. I like them a lot. I'm going to zoom out and show you the very last. The very last type of paint is acrylic paint. Your most basic craft acrylic paint. They come in little bottles like this. I have every single color that you could possibly want. You can always mix them. You will need a paper plate as your paint palette, and I poured out a very small amount of blue onto the plate. I'll compare it with my thumbnail. It's roughly the size of my thumbnail. With acrylic paint, you need a small acrylic brush. They are not the bamboo brushes. Bamboo brushes are not for acrylic. When I apply the paint to the brush, I roll the bristles into the paint so you get a nice pointed tip, and then you can just go right on into your sneaker and start painting. Unlike watercolors, acrylic paints, you can work next to a wet area with a different color. They will not bleed into each other. So that's why acrylic paint is really nice to work with, because it doesn't matter if it's wet or dry. I think that this type of paint is way more solid in color than the watercolors. So the watercolors are transparent, and what we say in art terms is that the acrylic is opaque, meaning you can't see through it. So transparent and opaque. So here are your three choices. You have watercolor pencils, look like this. You need a bamboo brush with them, and you need a little cup of water at your table. Or watercolors themselves, you'll need a paint tray, bamboo brush, and you'll have to choose your colors from the liquid containers. Or acrylic paint that looks like this. You will need an acrylic brush and a paper plate as your palette. The choice is yours. You can make it yourself. I am not going to tell you what you should do. Have fun.